Hello, I'm Richard Horton, and this is my final presentation done on my final paper, which was about the great presidents and how certain obstacles and unfortunate events allow them to become great. I'm going to start with Abraham Lincoln. In my paper, I actually use a survey conducted by a lot of historians and scholars that ranks the presidents by their greatness, and the paper has Abraham Lincoln ranked as first, George Washington second, and Franklin D. Roosevelt third. So those are the three examples I use in my paper. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll start with the background on each president and then go on to the obstacles that they encountered. So to begin with Abraham Lincoln, he was born in 1809 in Kentucky. After his family relocated to Illinois, that's where he was raised and spent most of his life. He eventually went on to become a member of the Illinois House of Representatives, and then representative for Illinois in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he only served one term. After that, he was elected the Republican candidate for President of the United States. A lot of it had to do with some high-profile speeches he gave and some debates he got in with who would become his opponent, Stephen Douglas, who was pro-slavery, whereas Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery. And he became the 16th president of the United States. So Abraham Lincoln's two primary obstacles as president were the Civil War and the issue of slavery, which were connected. The issue of slavery had been a contentious issue throughout our nation's history, even up to the writing of our Constitution. And Abraham Lincoln was notably anti-slavery, although he did not want to abolish slavery in the southern states. He just wanted to keep slavery from spreading. Regardless, the southern states didn't like this. They felt for some time that the North had been trying to take away its livelihood, its way of life. So as soon as Lincoln was elected 16th president, several southern states seceded from the Union and created the Confederate States. When Lincoln had a federal ship try to resupply Fort Sumter, which was in, I believe, South Carolina territory on an island, the Confederacy attacked the fort and the Civil War began. So Lincoln's primary motive for fighting in the Civil War after this attack was to preserve the Union. Later, it became about freeing the slaves, but it wasn't initially about that. It was just about keeping the Union together and whole. Later, it became apparent that freeing the slaves would be a practical notion, and he started with issuing his famous Emancipation Proclamation and eventually freed the slaves as a whole when the Civil War ended and they were made citizens and freed by the 13th and 14th Amendments, which were actually passed after his death, and that ended slavery. So he's mostly remembered and held in warm regard for winning the Civil War, keeping the Union together, and abolishing slavery. So basically, the point of this is to argue that without these obstacles to overcome, these men perhaps wouldn't be considered great presidents. In fact, they may have had some somewhat run-of-the-mill presidencies. So next on our list is George Washington. He was obviously our first president, and that's what he's most remembered for. But if we take a look at his background, we'll find out that he was very important in the founding of our nation. So looking at this, he was born in 1732 in Virginia, while the Virginia was still a British colony, and he was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. Eventually, when the First and Second Continental Congresses convened to voice their issues about the British Empire, he was there as a delegate. And after the Second Continental Congress, when the Americans decided to declare their independence, he was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And it was then that he led the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and eventually succeeded in securing American independence from the British Empire. After that, America adopted the Articles of Confederation, which was a pretty weak federal government, and it guaranteed most power remained with the states, but as such, it was pretty ineffectual. So, states sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention to revise the Articles, which, as we know, it went a lot further than that. George Washington was elected president of the Constitutional Convention, basically ensuring that things that they stuck to their mission and that things went by smoothly. And in doing so, he had to relegate his own opinions and keep kind of stay out of the debates for the most part, because he felt he should be pretty unbiased as the president of the Constitutional Convention, though he did occasionally speak up. And after this, after the Constitution was finished and was ratified by the several states, I think it was ratified in 1788, George Washington eventually became the first president of the United States, which was extremely important. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. On the next slide. So his obstacles were being the leader of the American Revolution, which obviously happened before he was president, and then being the first president of a new nation. So just winning the revolution was extremely difficult. I mean, we were basically fighting the most powerful nation in the world at the time, and he didn't really win the revolution by winning a bunch of battles. He basically won it just by keeping the military together and intact, and almost being involved in a war of attrition, so to speak, because he knew that us being on our homeland and Britain being so far away, it would be very costly to them to keep this war going. And eventually, when the French intervened on our side, we were able to secure victory at Yorktown and eventually win the war. Being the first president of a nation was extremely challenging in itself, because he knew that the people that came after him were going to follow his lead and that he was going to set precedent as first president. So everything he did, he thought carefully about, and he was very cautious about what decisions he made and the way that he acted, even how he addressed people and how people addressed him as president. And just the sheer responsibility of being the first president was a great obstacle. He handled it rather well, and as such, he is remembered as one of the best presidents in our history. We're now on to Franklin Roosevelt, and we'll talk a little bit about his background. So Franklin Roosevelt's background, interestingly, a lot of his background mirrors that of his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who was the 26th president of the United States. So yes, Theodore Roosevelt was his fifth cousin, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was actually Theodore Roosevelt's niece. So he and his wife were very distantly related. He was born in 1882 in New York. He was eventually elected to the New York State Senate. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was the 44th Governor of New York, and finally the 32nd President of the United States. An interesting thing about Franklin Roosevelt that kind of has to do with George Washington. George Washington ran and was president for 2 terms. After the second term, he refused to run for a third term, and it kind of set the precedent that each president be president for only 2 terms. And while some candidates unsuccessfully tried for a third term, including Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt was the first one to break that tradition and was actually elected to a third and fourth term as president. And after his presidency, legislation was passed to ensure that presidents could only serve 2 terms. So Franklin Roosevelt's obstacles were primarily the 2 obstacles of the Great Depression and World War II. The Great Depression, our economy had never been so bad off, and it basically slid the entire country into a terrible economic recession, obviously not helped by the Dust Bowl. Americans were pretty much desperate. Roosevelt ran on a platform of change, and he was elected. And then he started to implement his New Deal policies, which are still very famous. Most people have heard that phrase, the New Deal, and it seemed to help, and it actually was a precursor for a lot of the social programs we have today, including Social Security, among others. Eventually, at the end of the 1930s, World War II broke out in Europe. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, America entered the war at the end of 1941, and that was the largest war ever in world history, and he was president through most of it and helped us get through it. It was a tough time, and a lot of basically these obstacles are why he kept running for president, and it's why he kept being elected president, is because the people had faith in him and came to view him in pretty high regard. And when he died, the nation lamented incredibly. And it was toward the end of World War II in 1945. Truman eventually took over, dropped the atomic bombs, and the war eventually ended completely. So in conclusion, these three men that we've discussed that are considered the three greatest presidents of the United States did some pretty tremendous things, and they're remembered for some pretty incredible things throughout our nation's history. However, they did those things because the opportunity presented itself. That's not to take anything away. That's not to say they didn't have distinguished personal traits that allowed them to accomplish what they did. But had they had presidencies in a non-conflict time, or a time without any major issues such as the Great Depression or war, they may have very well had a pretty run-of-the-mill presidency, as many of the other people pictured here did.